Welcome to The Road. This is a weekly podcast of All Saints Lutheran Church. I'm your host, John Pedersen, and I serve as pastor. Each week, we reflect on faith, life, and navigating the road ahead. The language of journey is common when we think about life. It has its joys and challenges along the way, and we all need a little encouragement and guidance at times to keep us going. There's a word in the Bible, asphalia, which means truth, but it's the same root word we use in English for asphalt, if you can believe that. It's a solid surface that makes travel easier and more assured. And so every week we're going to be exploring elements of faith and life that keep us on the road. Faith isn't about living a perfect life. It's about finding our way, getting through rough spots, but seeking out those great vistas too. You can find my weekly message here, but you'll also find special conversations with guests who have insights on things like wellness, parenting, and living with unique purpose. If you appreciate this podcast, remember to subscribe where possible and share it with a friend. Here's this week's message. Well, we're continuing our series, You Belong. And last week I talked about Jesus and Paul and how they laid the groundwork for seeing beyond distinctions to a world in which each of us belongs and can experience God's love as children of God. That welcome into community and a caring relationship is freeing. To be excluded or condemned can be isolating and the opposite of freedom. It can feel like carrying around a weight. Throughout history, humans have faced oppression, injustice, lack of control over their lives and circumstances, unable to move freely, act freely, think freely, to have true freedom of information. And to look back through that long human history, you recognize that what we think of as freedom in modern terms, at least in our country, is just a blip. Those who founded our country pointed out a history of repeated injuries and usurpations in the Declaration of Independence that came before it. We're talking about freedom, and if you're listening to this message, we're a week away from July 4th, but the cause of freedom is always timely. What are the forms of freedom you appreciate most? In what ways do you see freedom most challenged today? Paul saw instances where it was challenged in his day. Freedom was an important value that came through in his teachings as well as the teachings of Jesus. We're spending a few weeks reflecting on Paul's letter to the Galatians, and it was a central part of Scripture for Martin Luther and has been for many others. Paul's first words in today's reading were, "For freedom, Christ has set us free." What does that mean exactly? That it's possible to use your freedom in such a way that you end it for yourself or for others. Christ set us free, not so that we would just give ours away or take it away from someone else. Stand firm, therefore, and do not submit again to a yoke of slavery. This is Paul making an unequivocal statement about what's central to Christian faith. Paul is definitely speaking about freedom from a little different vantage point than the way we normally use the word today, but there's also plenty of overlap. Knowing you have freedom in your relationship with God and in the way you live out your faith impacts your overall life and well-being. Last week I spoke about more rigid forms of faith or philosophy that lean heavily on law rather than grace. This is something that churches like All Saints have historically cautioned against, drawing especially from passages like these from Paul. After Paul makes the importance of freedom clear, he then reminds Christians to be careful in how they use freedom. "For you are called to freedom, brothers and sisters, only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for self-indulgence, but through love become slaves to one another." Now, obviously, his use of the word slaves is awkward to us with our understanding of history, but Paul's intent is to invite us to be dutiful servants to one another. Freedom isn't simply for ourselves. The whole law is summed up in a single commandment. He says, "You shall love your neighbor as yourself." Love is an embodiment of the Spirit. That's why Paul says that if we are led by the Spirit, we are no longer subject to the law. It's because love is the ultimate fulfillment of where the law is supposed to lead us in the first place. But what Paul says over and over again is that the law always falls short. The law, at best, can only establish boundaries and guideposts. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. All God has wanted from the beginning is for us to live in a loving relationship with Him and with one another. That's the goal. That's the point of all of this. What we hear in today's passage from Galatians is that in our broken world, some of these cautions and boundaries are indeed necessary, but that doesn't mean they should occupy the central focus of our faith or our life. When any people make laws, policies, prohibitions, and requirements the end goal and primary focus of life or faith, it becomes misguided. Our own spiritual tradition tells us that that approach falls short, whether it's carried out by a parent or any form of government. The reason for that is that the law is a blunt instrument, and although it serves an important purpose, it never reflects the highest vision for life. A few weeks ago, in my message, Beyond Division, I said we should also be mindful of the temptation to try and enforce the values and beliefs of faith on others through coercion or power, which would be contrary to the spirit of Jesus. The warnings that Paul gives against certain behaviors is a way of pointing people away from what will bring a loss of freedom to themselves and others. I do think that for many modern ears, lists of vices like this sound harsh. They sound shaming and puritanical, perhaps. It's worth mentioning that this is one of a number of passages in which we see Paul drawing from some shared philosophical language from his day. It's very clearly similar to the lists of vices of the ancient Stoics who dominated the Roman world. This was, in some ways, the standard list of don'ts from that culture. No one would have been especially surprised by it. Stoics commonly use these lists of vices and virtues, which we'll hear also, as a way of educating people and seeking to train people and heal them of improper thinking that led to suffering. For Stoics, knowledge held the potential to free people from their slavery to the passions, as they called them. Passion was seen as an impulse, a movement of the soul, which was excessive and contrary to reason. The goal was to remain unmoved. Passion was seen as irrational and contrary to nature. Often Stoics saw a link between the flesh and passion, and often for American ears, when we hear flesh, we tend to focus more exclusively on one type of passion. But the Stoic understanding of passion was much broader and deeper and included mental states that led to enmities, strife, jealousy, anger, quarrels, dissensions, factions, envy, drunkenness, and carousing, as we heard. Certainly some of those are still a cause for concern today. Stoics believe that when passions take over, our own happiness suffers, and in fact, the happiness of others can suffer. Although Stoics didn't believe we should be moved by passion, they did accept some good conditions of being. These included joy, wish, and caution. Not a very long list. By joy, they also didn't mean the kind of exuberant joy that we think of when we use the word. It was a more moderated delight. For a Stoic, if you find joy in a friend, it's with the understanding that you shouldn't be hurt if that friend is absent at some point. You also shouldn't be overcome with joy in the presence of a friend to the extent that you're led to commit wrongs out of a sense of loyalty or to abandon your responsibilities by becoming too preoccupied with that friend. Wish was an inclination of what you would like without being overcome and consumed by that wish with things like greed or envy. This is so that if you didn't get what you wished for, you wouldn't be miserable or disappointed. Wish represents a kind of harmony with nature. I would like to see my friend if possible. If not, that's okay too. Caution represented a kind of guardedness without allowing that to become fear. Stoics didn't need to be passionless in the sense of being stone cold, but they sought balance with nature and to even out the ups and downs of life. Interestingly, Stoicism has become popular again in therapeutic settings. The writings of Marcus Aurelius and others have been offered as a way to reflect on life without becoming too overcome by the pains and fears of life. So why, over the last few minutes, have I been giving you Stoicism 101? Because it's oozing out of Paul's words from Galatians today. Stoics offered lists of virtues as well. Paul changes that up and refers to them not as virtues, but as fruits of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, generosity, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. And many of those particular words are actually quite distinct from the common ones you would find in Stoic virtue lists, except for self-control, which was very typical. But in both the vices and virtues, Paul has taken this well-known framework from his day and put a twist on it. Whereas in Stoicism, knowledge was the source of virtue, and Stoics saw themselves as doctors of the soul, seeking to eliminate ignorance and error. For Paul, the problem wasn't the lack of knowledge, but something deeper: sin, something only the Spirit could overcome. Sin is literally missing the mark. In fact, the law has a habit of only amplifying sin because it can never actually create the right inner spirit that will get rid of sin. So it's only through the Spirit that we come to live in a new way, embodying not just virtues, but a life of grace. A life that embodies love is the end goal. That kind of life is focused outward. It extends grace and freedom wherever possible. And yes, at times boundaries need to be set, but in the long arc of life, we are renewed and find meaning and purpose in love. In fact, the reference to love may have irked Stoics. Although both Jesus and Paul were well aware of the Stoic tradition and occasionally used that philosophical language and framework to speak to people in a way they could understand, Christian faith is not simply a form of Stoicism at all. Some of its teachings do overlap with Christian faith, but Jesus lived his life with passion. He loved us so deeply and suffered so deeply that we have a name for a defining week in his life. It's called Passion Week, also known as Holy Week, when we retell the story of Jesus' death and resurrection. In Christian faith, it's okay to embody passion as an expression of our love for others. Jesus lived his life to free us from the weight of feeling condemned, from feeling excluded from community, from being defined only by error or sin. Paul's early life was defined by harshly enforcing strict laws and by hunting down those who violated them. His entire life was turned upside down and transformed when Jesus intercepted him on the road to Damascus and showed him another way to live. Paul later saw how dark and oppressive his previous life had been. He embraced love and forgiveness and the freedom we find in a gracious and loving God who welcomes you and me and every neighbor. And in fact, Paul himself ended up living a life of sacrifice. He gave his own life in service to the gospel, a full expression in the same way that Jesus did, filled with passion for the gospel, for love of neighbor. Because of the love of Jesus and because of the life transformation in someone like Paul, we still have a message that reminds us that we belong, that you belong. You belong in God's presence. You belong as a child of God, as an inheritor of God's love and grace and the fullness of his joy. This week, dwell in that love and know that you are welcomed into this community, that you are embraced by God. Amen. That's this week's message. You don't have to navigate the road ahead alone. You can join with others at All Saints. Visit allsaintsmtka.org for more information. Have a great week.